She reached up to the sky of stars and caught the red-hot light of the North Star. The earth, walking with blood-soaked feet. She challenged the whip, the gun, the knife. She challenged the fire, pulled from the bodies of slaves, made into
Welcome back. As always, President Donald Trump announced on June 21st that the U.S. had conducted successful airstrikes against 3 key Iranian nuclear facilities under the pretext of destroying Iran's military nuclear program, a mythical program, a program that by all accounts ended in 2003. President Masoud Pezeshkian has been very clear that the U.S. strikes on Iran were illegal and that Iran had never intended to develop a nuclear bomb. President Pezeshkian is correct. Trump is wrong. What can be done to get the world out of this dangerous nuclear spiral? Let's connect some dots and find out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.
Welcome to the Connecting the Dots podcast with Dr. Wilmer Leon, and I am Wilmer Leon. With each show, my guests and I provide insight and analysis into current events and the broader historical context in which most of these events take place. Let's quickly look at some of today's headlines. Trump says U.S. will resume weapons deliveries to Ukraine. Quote, they have to be able to defend themselves, end quote, the president said of Ukraine days after the White House announced some arms shipments to Kyiv had been halted. I thought Trump said he would end this conflict in one day. This issue is relevant to today's topic. Russia is a nuclear armed adversary who has changed its nuclear doctrine in response to U.S. provocations in Ukraine. The Wall Street Journal reports New York City real estate executives throw money behind Eric Adams to counter the rise of Mamdani. Developers turn their backs on former Governor Andrew Cuomo, and they are hosting fundraisers for the incumbent mayor. And you all remember, this is why I said last week, when I was asked about my thoughts about the results of this race, that it was really too early to tell. Now we're starting to see which way the money is falling. The establishment is starting to show its hand. And finally, the Wall Street Journal says U.S. only has 25% of all Patriot missile interceptors needed for Pentagon's military plans. The U.S., again, has only about 25% after burning through stockpiles in the Middle East. Folks, it is a dangerous, perilous trajectory. On today's episode, the issue before us is nuclear war and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, which bans all activities having to do with nuclear weapons. How can the TPNW achieve its goal and rid the world of nuclear weapons? My guest is the executive director of nuclearban.us. He holds a PhD in peace studies from Bradford University, and he is the author of a great book, Nuclear Abolition, a Scenario. Dr. Timmon Wallis, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you.
And let me say, as I said to you offline, I haven't had a chance to finish the book, but what I've read up to this point, great work. Well written, easy to read, great work.
Thank you so much.
First, let me ask you about the title. Why do you present this as a scenario instead of, let's say, a more grander approach as the solution?
Well, I don't know if you're familiar with the book Nuclear War, a Scenario, but it was a bestseller on the New York Times bestseller list last year by Annie Jacobson, who's written a number of other books and is already a best-selling author. And her book takes us through the step-by-step unfolding of a nuclear war. It only lasts 72 minutes before the entire world is come to an end as we know it. And so that inspired me to write a book that sort of takes the scenario in the opposite direction. You know, how could we envisage getting rid of these weapons? I mean, they've been around for 80 years now. It's just coming up to the 80th anniversary of the first nuclear test in New Mexico, and then the nuclear weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Japan and Nagasaki. And it's time to rid ourselves of this danger, and we're on the way to doing that, as you mentioned, with the treaty, which we could talk more about. But I wanted to lay out in a format similar to her book how this is possible and how it's already happening.
In the foreword, Ivana Nikolic Hughes quotes former President Kennedy speaking in 1961 before the UN General Assembly, quote, "Today, every inhabitant of this planet must contemplate the day when this planet may no longer be habitable. Every man, woman, and child lives under a nuclear sword of Damocles, hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. The weapons of war must be abolished before they abolish us," end quote. She then goes on to write that President Kennedy was painfully aware of this unique feature of nuclear weapons. What he didn't know was that nuclear war, in which hundreds or even thousands of warheads are used in attacks, could give rise to a nuclear winter as a consequence of the enormous fires and soot released in the atmosphere. I find her distinction between a nuclear weapon in Kennedy's context and a nuclear war or the proliferation of nuclear weapons in the current context interesting, especially as Russia has modified its nuclear doctrine. Am I making more of that point than I should? Because I thought that was a very profound statement by her.
Well, of course, they didn't know. I mean, when the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, they had no idea about the effects of radiation and the effect and how far the fallout would end up all across the globe. And as we've learned from subsequent tests in the Pacific and so on, and as you mentioned, in the 60s, they didn't know about nuclear winter and the effects of the soot from massive fires from cities on fire, and how that would all affect the global climate. And we know much more about climate now than so the fact that this is a climate issue is something that a lot of people are concerned about in the context of the climate crisis.
Her point about Kennedy's point about hanging by the slenderest of threads, capable of being cut at any moment by accident or miscalculation or by madness. there was a conscious decision to drop the bomb on Nagasaki. There was a conscious decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima. But now we seem to be caught up in this game of brinksmanship. And so, to Kennedy's point, then the miscalculation, the mistake seems to be much more inevitable now than it was during his time.
Well, one of the things in my book is that I am using the Doomsday Clock.
Yes.
Which I'm sure your listeners are familiar with, which in Kennedy's time, well, I mean, in the 40s it was set at 3 minutes to midnight. How close we are to doomsday, and over the course of the Cold War, it moved back and forth. It went when the Cold War ended in the early 90s. It went back as far as 14 minutes to midnight, and it's been inching its way back towards midnight all this time without people noticing. We're much closer to nuclear war and to the doomsday midnight than ever, than even in the 50s and 60s. So people are not aware of that. And in my book, what I try to do, instead of, as I mentioned, in Annie Jacobson's book, she follows the course of nuclear war unfolding, second by second. And mine is going the other direction. And I use the Doomsday Clock to say, well, there are things that we can do that are already happening around the world right now that are moving the clock back away from midnight. And we got to keep pushing it back until it's as far back as we can get it. So, to your point about the dangers and the unknowns, we're playing with fire, and the biggest risk is that people aren't paying attention.
Well, and that takes me to the next question, which I had in line here, the Doomsday Clock, and you open the first section of your book talking about the clock. As I looked at the report from January of this year, it now stands at 89 seconds to midnight. And you write in your preface, most people today go about their daily business as if there were no nuclear weapons, even now, completely oblivious to the existential threat these weapons pose to all of us. This issue, Timmon, doesn't resonate with Americans. It's not a topic in the Western mainstream press. Again, even as Russia has revised its nuclear protocol in response to U.S. action in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, the Ukraine war is a great example of how dangerous we are right now with the nuclear weapons. They're pointing at each other. They're on hair trigger alert. There's so many things that can go wrong and misunderstandings. And you've been mentioning about Israel and Iran, and of course the Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, but Israel does, and pretends that it doesn't. The U.S. does, and that the risks are so enormous, and that's why we've got to stop pretending that we're going to carry on forever with these weapons without getting rid of them. We have to get rid of these weapons, and it's not impossible. It's we've got rid of other weapons through treaties and through unilateral decisions, as well as through just general understanding that they're not militarily useful. And we've got to take these steps, and we've got to raise awareness about the dangers.
How much money in human intellectual capital do we spend, if not waste, on the U.S. nuclear program? You talk about this in your preface. Elaborate on that, please.
Well, I mean, a lot of the costs of nuclear weapons are hidden, and it's very hard to really unpack, all the different costs, including the fact that we have already enormous amounts of radioactive waste, high-level radioactive waste that nobody knows what to do with. I mean, 80 years we've been accumulating this, not just from the nuclear weapons program, but also from nuclear power plants. and we still have no clue how to keep this safe for literally thousands of years from getting into the wrong hands or getting into the environment. I mean, this is hugely dangerous, deadly radioactive waste, and that's so there's a cost there, which is hundreds of billions of dollars that have been put aside as a sort of estimate of what it will cost to handle this waste, but we'd have no idea. And then the total cost of nuclear weapons. I mean, it just went up last week with Trump's big ugly bill. They added several more billions to the nuclear weapons program that's already approaching 100 billion. I mean, again, it depends on how you calculate it. One of the biggest costs that Trump is already pushing way up is for missile defense. He wants to have this golden dome that's going to cost up to $300 billion over the coming decades, which is completely useless which we know. I mean, they've already spent $350 billion on research on this idea that you can somehow protect the entire country from incoming ballistic missiles of the scale of size of nuclear weapons, not the ones that are landing in Israel and so on. We're talking about intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they can't do it. And even if they spend all that money, there's so many ways that they can get around it. It's part of the escalation and the danger that thinking that you can somehow build your way out of being attacked. But the costs are enormous, and the most comprehensive study that was done, it was done quite a few years ago now, is called the Atomic Audit, and they calculated, this was in $1991, I think it was, or 94. They calculated that the total cost of nuclear weapons since the beginning in 1940s was over $5 trillion. And a huge percentage of the military budget, which was it's all hidden. People don't realize the huge extent that this weapon system, which in the best possible scenario will never ever be used, and in the worst means the end of our country. So it's just crazy we're talking about, and so that's why my book, which I guess you're getting to, is focused on these companies that are making all this money. I mean, this is such good business for a few very large military contractors who make enormous amounts of money from building these weapons that, as I said, in the best case scenario, they're never going to be used.
You mentioned just a few moments ago about the nuclear waste and the storage of the waste. Where is the waste being stored?
Well, right now it's all over the country. I mean, it's stored at the different facilities. I mean, there's just been Hanford in Washington State is one of the places where they were, enriching the uranium for decades. And they closed that plant down in I forget when, but several years ago, and they're still dealing with the waste. I mean, it's the largest cleanup project in human history to try to get deal with the waste, and they're just doing it little by little, trying to disperse it into canisters that are less likely to remain hot and dangerous, and melt the containers. There's just so much involved in this. I mean, they were going to put it under Yucca Mountain, right, in New Mexico or Nevada, I forget. But they spent billions on that, and now they've decided they can't put it there. But as I said, right now it's just all over. I mean, the different facilities. There's a facility in Idaho. There's one in Colorado. There's one in South Carolina. There's Tennessee, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. There's the Pantex plant in Texas. There's all the stuff in Nevada and New Mexico, and then there's all the military bases up in where the silos are in the Midwest, and where the warheads are stored in other Whitman Air Force Base and so on.
People would have thought with the Chernobyl accident that really would have put the world on notice, and that would have put the United States on notice. Houston, we have a problem, and there would have been a just a clarion call for a collaborative effort. We've got to do something, and we've got to do something now. And that event came and went. And we even had the issue at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict with the parties were playing with the nuclear facility as though it was a piece on a chessboard. Oh, we can send missiles into this thing. And, it makes no sense, Timmon.
No, and that's still an issue. I mean, the Zaporizhia plant that you're talking about, it's the largest nuclear reactor combination. I think there's 5 there. It's the largest complex in Europe, and it's in the middle of a war zone. I mean, it's crazy. And of course, Israel bombed. One of the targets in Iran was a nuclear reactor that they bombed, which wasn't operational, but still, it's hugely dangerous. Not to mention illegal under international laws and treaties. But this is why, my book is all about the companies, as I said, because, the logic of this and the rational things to do, are not being done because people are making a lot of money out of this. And that's what's driving this whole thing. And we've got to put pressure from the public, from the rest of the world. We've got to put pressure on these companies to get this to stop. That's the only thing we can do. They own Congress, they own the White House, they own the decision making, and they just keep going. I mean, they don't care. These companies, they don't care that we're risking the planet in the future, or that this waste is there's nowhere to put it. I mean, it's not their problem. They make the weapons. That's leave it for some future politician to figure out what to do with the waste. That's what we're facing.
And you write about the lobbyists. You write about the corporations. How much money is generated from this. And you also talk about the existential threat, the use of the easy for you to say, existential threat, how we are constantly put in fear that China is going to invade us, then Russia is going to invade us, and then after Russia invades us, then China is going to invade us, then North Korea. We're constantly either directly or subliminally bombarded with the existential threat, and we've got to do everything in our power to guard against it. And what never seems to be factored into this is if we would stop swatting the hornet's nest, we wouldn't have a problem with hornets.
Well, again, that's these companies, which I go after in the book very clearly.
Mm-hmm.
They don't just spend their money on lobbying Congress and all the ways that they sort of influence Congress, also through think tanks and academic funding of papers and so on. They're also putting out every single day, drip, 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 the propaganda that feeds our media, that everybody's hearing all the time, every day. That's Russia or China or North Korea or Iran. That's the problem, And I mean, it's not just these companies that are doing it, but I mean, they're funding the mainstream media and the think tanks that feed them and the academics that feed them. And, that's part of why, we can't get this message across. I mean, I've written a book, how many people will read it? I don't know. It's, I don't know how to reach a wider audience because they're all fed this propaganda day in and day out, every single day.
You have a piece in your prologue, which I found interesting in a book of this nature. You talk about post-election polls show that Americans voted for Trump for primarily two reasons: the price of eggs and the number of immigrants entering the United States. And you then write that most people did not vote for the wholesale dismantling of the federal government. And you're absolutely right. The only point I would add to that is the Trump whisperer, Steve Bannon, warned us that their whole mission is the deconstruction of the administrative state. But explain why you found that data to be relevant to this issue.
Well, because again, I'm trying to make the argument that we've got to go after these companies, and we can, and we've done it before, and we have the tools, and we know what to do. And the audience that I'm trying to reach are people that I deal with every day who are like, well, either we have to elect Democrats and take back the government from Trump, and that's going to somehow solve it, when we know that Biden was just as bad on the nuclear issue as Trump is, I mean, if not worse. But also the people who are like, well, we've got to put all our effort into convincing people that we've got to do something about this issue. And what I'm saying is, people don't need convincing. I mean, we've done polls. There have been polls for decades which show that even in the United States, people don't want nuclear weapons. I mean, if you ask them, it's not. I mean, they don't think about it, and they're not doing anything about it. But nobody wants nuclear weapons, and they don't want to spend money. They don't want wars. They don't. So it's not about trying to convince people. It's about putting pressure on the ones that are making this all happen. So that's why I brought that up, and I also linked it to the epilogue, which is, well, maybe Trump would, he talks about denuclearization. He just spent lots of more money on nuclear weapons than ever before. But if we take him at his word, he says all these things, so that's still a possibility. It's not a very likely one, but I just threw that out there.
So talk a little bit more about how the book is organized, because you open with turning back the Doomsday Clock. Our story begins on the 28th of January at the handsome concrete glass structure, the United States Institute for Peace. And a lot of folks would ask the question, why is the Institutes for Peace so highly guarded and protected? Why is the thought of peace getting out to the world like nuclear fallout?
Well, I was there for the Doomsday Clock unveiling for this year at the Institute of Peace, and then a few weeks later, it was trashed, by the Doge thugs that went in there and pulled down all the pictures and signs and so on. So it was it meant something to me. But I also, and I've known people that have worked there. I've spent my whole life working on peace issues, not just the nuclear issue, but and I also know lots of people who are critical of the Institute of Peace. I mean, it was set up by Ronald Reagan. It's kind of a fig leaf for a lot of other things that aren't necessarily making more peace in the world. But I mean, it's still doing something like USAID. It's saving people's lives, and it's one of the things that are, targeted by this administration. But I forget what your question was now.
Well, no, but the just about the organization and the structure of the book, and that you start off by talking about that January 28th release of the Doomsday Clock report. And you also make the point that and I think this is on one level could be considered very simple, but on another level so relevant, and that is you write that people have to understand that we're not doomed to nuclear extinction. Talk about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's get into the thick of it then. So, the book is structured around these different steps that can be taken, that are being taken, to move the doomsday clock back away from midnight, towards peace. And it's not at all impossible. And that's really the goal of my book, is to show that this is totally doable. We can do this. We've got rid of other weapons systems over the decades. We haven't totally got rid of chemical weapons or biological weapons, but there are treaties that ban them, and there are very, very few countries that still maintain stockpiles. The U.S. doesn't anymore. The landmines have been banned, and the U.S., for example, has never signed the landmines treaty.
Correct.
But they stopped using landmines. They stopped making landmines, and the companies were forced out of the business. And, Biden, to his great shame, agreed to send landmines that were still hanging around to Ukraine, against this treaty, which the U.S. hasn't signed. But until that point, the U.S. wasn't using landmines. It wasn't, they're out of their picture. Same with cluster munitions. Same with some of the older weapon systems that have been banned for much longer, like dum-dum bullets and so on. So it's not impossible. It's a long way from ending war and ending all military and so on. This is just one little step to get rid of nuclear weapons, but it's a pretty critical one for the survival of, the human species. And we can do it. And so I lay out one way. It's only a scenario. It's not the scenario. It's not the only way, but it's one way, by taking these steps. And so I divide the book into two main parts. One is the international steps that are being taken in relation to this treaty that you mentioned, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And the other is steps that are being taken inside the United States. And my whole sort of strategy of the book is this kind of pincer movement of pressures on the companies coming from all over the world, different countries, putting more and more pressure on the companies that make nuclear weapons, and cities and states and faith communities and hospitals and pension funds and so on, putting more and more pressure on these companies from inside the United States. And that combination being enough, my hope is anyway, that would be enough to push them to move us out of the nuclear weapons era. And once the US does that, my final part of the book explains how the other countries will follow. It's the biggest mistake that most people have with regard to nuclear weapons is thinking, well, what if we get rid of nuclear weapons and nobody else will? Well, that's not the problem.
In fact, you have a section, the myth of nuclear deterrence, and you write, most people, if they think about nuclear war at all, assume it can't happen. Nuclear weapons are there to, quote, keep the peace, end quote, we are told. And the biggest lie of all, nuclear weapons are so effective as a so-called deterrent that they'll never have to be used. And I reiterate to folks, Russia just revamped its nuclear response protocol.
Sure. I did write an earlier book all about deterrence, and there's been other people have written, great books on this topic. But so I didn't go into a lot of detail in this one, but deterrence. There's so many holes in this theory. The biggest mistake people make is this assumption that because we've had nuclear weapons since 1945, and because we haven't had a nuclear war, then it's only logical that nuclear weapons have prevented nuclear war from happening, which is just nonsense. It's not. That's one factor out of many factors that have taken place since 1945. Not mentioning the United Nations and the treaties and the fact that people don't want a nuclear war. That's the biggest reason we haven't had a nuclear war, not because we're so effective as a deterrent. But the biggest problem with the deterrence theory is that it actually makes nuclear war more likely, because a deterrent only works if it's deterrence is a threat. That's all it is. It's a threat, and it only works as a threat if people believe you're going to carry it out. I mean, this is the same with any kind of deterrent, whether it's a parent using a deterrent against children's behavior, or whether teachers or court system, prisons, any kind of deterrent only works because if it does, because it's seen as a threat that will be carried out if you don't behave. Well, the longer it's been since that threat has ever been carried out, which was in 1945, 80 years ago, the longer that goes on, the less believable that it is as a threat. So the more pressure there is to actually use a nuclear weapon in order to prove to a potential opponent that the threat is real. So the danger increases every single day that the so-called deterrent means that we're going to end up using nuclear weapons just to prove that they're a deterrent. So that's
and folks, was it 83? There was this Russian analyst, Stanislav.
Yeah.
He got a warning. He's in a bunker somewhere in Russia, and he gets a warning on his screen, I believe, of an incoming missile.
Yeah, a bunch of incoming missiles. Yeah, he was in charge of the radar, the early warning radar in Russia at the time. I don't remember the year either. I think because I think
it was 83.
It could well have been, and he, his instructions were, you have incoming missiles, you fire back. You
launch on notice.
Ring the president and say, we got to fire these. And his gut reaction was not to do it. I mean, he disobeyed orders. He was demoted for it, and cast out. But he saved the world. I mean, there's a movie called "The Man Who Saved the World" because he did. He could have launched nuclear war. It would turn out to be a mistake. There's been numerous mistakes. That's the other thing which is so scary. Nuclear war. I mean, we've got crazy people, with their finger on the button, but we've also got systems that are not perfect, and there's mistakes. People press the wrong button, or see a flock of geese and think it's missiles coming, or whatever it is. And again, the more this goes on, the more chances of that kind of mistake or risk or misunderstanding, miscommunication, miscalculation, those risks just increase until something terrible happens.
His name was Stanislav Petrov.
Yeah.
Petrov.
Thank you.
And there was something that told him this is a system error.
Yeah.
Not incoming ICBMs.
Right.
And he did not push the button. And let me just take folks that are watching this, you need to share this program right now. you this is some serious business here. You need to share this show right now. Folks need to know that this conversation is taking place right now. So those of you that can take a moment and send out a quick message to your brethren and your sisterin. I just made up a word. You need to let folks know. You need to launch on notice, and I'm putting you all on notice. And yeah, the Jamon, since I asked, yeah, go ahead and let folks know, because this is real talk. This is real talk. And in fact, that statement takes me to a point that I was going to make that I decided not to make. Now I'm going to make the point. We, Timmon, tell me your thoughts. We are trusting people with the existence of the planet that don't deserve our trust. And it seems to be more, that statement seems to be more accurate today than in years past.
Yeah, well, I mean, the truth is, there's no safe hands for an unsafe weapon, and this is a very unsafe weapon. But you're absolutely right. We're now got Trump, who's totally unpredictable, and was bragging about his button being bigger than Kim Jong-un's button. Back in the last time he was in the White House.
Mm-hmm.
It's dangerous, absolutely, and it's dangerous for somebody like Putin, who's also, as you keep mentioning, threatening to use nuclear weapons. The more he's pushed into a corner, I mean, right now he's winning the war in Ukraine, so it's not really an issue.
Correct.
But he could be pushed into a corner, and he's not immune to making a decision like that. Same with everybody else. I mean, Israel. I mean, I wrote an article about the bombing of the nuclear facilities in Iran,
Mm-hmm.
and I said, the good news is that they didn't use nuclear weapons to do those attacks, because that strengthens the taboo against nuclear weapons, and that's all to the good as far as I'm concerned. We're making it more and more unlikely that nuclear weapons will be used. However, if it turns out, as it seems likely, that they didn't really do that much damage to Iran's nuclear facilities. I mean, they're underground, they're 300 feet underground. The biggest bomb is still, it's just a bomb on the surface of a mountain, and so it's still not impossible that they will use a nuclear weapon next time. And Israel is not. I mean, we're talking about madmen there too.
Mm-hmm. Very much so.
We're in a very, very extremely dangerous world right now, and that is why we've got to take these steps to move away from this ridiculous, unbelievably stupid system that we're in.
Chapter 2, you ask an incredibly important question, and language is, of course, very, very important. And you ask the question, why discuss abolition rather than arms control or non-proliferation?
Yeah, well, again, part of the, and I blame these companies to a large extent on their constant, drip propaganda and so on. But I mean, one of the things that we're facing is this belief, not only that we don't have to worry about nuclear weapons, but that the problem is other people's nuclear weapons, Iran's nuclear weapons, and not our own. I mean, the U.S. started this whole business. It invented nuclear weapons. It's invented every single development in the history of nuclear weapons developments, and it's led the way, and it continues to lead the way, and we've got to be the ones to lead the way out of this. And so non-proliferation, which to many people means like we don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, we don't want North Korea or whatever, and the same with arms control. Like there are a number of bills in Congress that call for reductions of the nuclear arsenal, and it's on the face of it, that's great. We want less nuclear weapons, sure, but the argument that they give is, we've got too many. We don't need so many. We need fewer, and often the argument is couched around deterrence. We only need as many as we need to maintain deterrence. We got too many, so that kind of thinking reinforces the idea, well, we're going to keep these weapons forever as a deterrent. We just want fewer of them. And that's not going to solve the problem at all. We have to get rid of these weapons once and for all. We have to say no to any kind of continuation of this system that we have that maintains a weapon system that could end all life on Earth if we're not careful.
President Eisenhower, in his 1960 farewell address, warned us of the confluence of interest between the industrial base and the military. He coined it the military industrial complex. And you've been talking about these companies that are in control of so much and are sucking, as Dr. King talked about, the demonic suction tube of militarism. Can you let's put some names on some of these companies? And because, for example, when you start talking about Lockheed Martin and you start talking about Raytheon, then those names should go off in people's heads, because those are the companies that underwrite Meet the Press. And so not only are they sucking money out of the budget, not only are they wasting money on military and Boeing, but they're also incredibly influential on the information you receive.
Yep, that's exactly what I was trying to get at. Yes. And, one of the arguments in my book is, we have been here before and we have been successful. So, for instance, General Electric in the 1980s, General Electric was the largest corporation in the United States, overall, the largest. It was also the largest nuclear weapons contractor in the United States. And they pulled out completely from nuclear weapons. And if you Google General Electric nuclear weapons right now, you'll find on their website a page that says, we have nothing to do with nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. I mean, they care about their image with the public. They don't want to be seen as having anything to do with nuclear weapons. And that is because they were under enormous public pressure in the 1980s. There was boycotts, there was divestment going on. And Ronald Reagan, who used to be the public face of General Electric before he was president, I mean, he had a very close relationship with General Electric. And General Electric was losing millions from these boycotts. I mean, there's a whole film called Deadly Deception, which is about the national boycott of General Electric in the 1980s, where hospitals were refusing to buy MRI machines worth millions, from General Electric because of their nuclear weapons involvement. And millions of people, literally, I think 5 million people were documented as refusing to buy General Electric light bulbs during that time. So there was a massive campaign going on, and General Electric pulled the plug. They said, we're not having anything more to do with nuclear weapons. And several other companies who were household names, Ford, DuPont, Westinghouse, trying to think of some of the other companies, but I mean, I think they're in the book. But I mean, these companies pulled out under pressure, and we can do that again. And that's really the argument in my book.
And GE is important, because when you go back to the Atoms for Peace program, I believe it was General Electric that was building nuclear reactors. Oh, yeah. And that's how Iran first got their first nuclear reactor, was sold to them by General Electric I think in the 50s.
Well, General Electric still does make nuclear reactors, as far as I know, but they don't make nuclear weapons.
No. I was just talking about
right. Yeah.
The integration between the technology. That's where I was going with that. So again, a great point about abolition. And you just went into chapter 3, the politics of pressure. And part of this, I think, is that we have become so tribalized in our politics that coalition building is more challenging than it has been in the past. And so being able to put the types of pressure on Congress, on companies that we have been used to applying is now more difficult to do.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I'm really focusing on cities and states, because they have real pressure on these companies. I mean, you mentioned like Lockheed Martin, for example. I mean, Boeing makes planes, so that's not many people buy their own plane, but Lockheed Martin makes almost nothing that's not military. So you can't have a boycott like of General Electric anymore. However, they do make all kinds of hospital equipment. They make IT systems for schools. They build roads and bridges and tunnels and so on. These companies are all implicated in big multi-million-dollar projects, which cities and even more so states and whole countries, have contracts with. And so that's why if we can get more of these cities and states and countries to take this kind of action, that can really have an impact on these companies. And as I said in the book, I mean, I gave examples where this is already happening. I mean, my own city here in Massachusetts, Northampton, has, we had to go through the state legislature and get a permission from the governor and all the rest of it to get this law passed in Northampton. But we have now in Northampton, Massachusetts, like several other cities around the country, a boycott of any nuclear weapons company having a contract with the city. So it's city policy not to contract with any of these companies. Oakland, California, which is a pretty big city, has this. New York City just recently committed to divesting its multi-billion-dollar pension funds from nuclear weapons companies. So these are the kinds of pressures which are already underway and can really make a difference, as they have been with the fossil fuel companies, for example.
Do you think that people have reached a point of boycott fatigue, or because I was my producer just sent me a message mentioning the Fukushima accident in Japan, and that was a huge and is still a huge issue. They're still trying to figure. I remember the last thing I remember hearing about this was, what are they going to do with the wastewater that they were using to cool the reactor? They were releasing it into the ocean.
Yeah.
So but that doesn't get much coverage. So is it a matter of boycott fatigue and lack of coverage, or your thoughts?
Well, one of the reasons why I have this pincer movement that I mentioned, international action as well as action in the U.S. I mean, the U.S. there's so many issues right now, especially now with the Trump administration, that people are concerned about and trying to do something about, whether it's immigration or racial justice or trans and LGBTQ issues, or there's so many issues. It's hard to get on the radar of people. And so but one of the exciting things that motivates people is to see what's happening in other countries. And there, whereas in this country, for example, the people that are working on this issue are mostly, older than me. I mean, I'm, already old, and then most of these people are in their 70s, 80s, even 90s, who still remember, the nuclear weapons threat and are still working on it. But in the rest of the world, there's young people working on this issue, like lots of them. And they're working on it in countries that you would never believe are committed to this. Like, Brazil is got a huge movement, but so has Kazakhstan and Philippines and Peru, and these countries where you don't immediately think of like activists. There are young people working on this issue and pushing their governments to do something about it, and they are doing something about it. So that's a way of motivating people here. I'm hoping to get off their butts and do something in solidarity with these other countries.
Kevin Baptiste asks, given what you recently stated, how likely do you feel that nuclear weapons would be used purposely? 50-50, or what percentage do you put because we hear about dirty bombs, depleted uranium. They're pushing the envelope.
Yeah, I mean, it's a race between getting rid of these weapons before it's too late and having them used. And I mean, I'm not going to put a number to it, but I mean, I'm doing this full time because I'm concerned, very concerned, and as are many other people. We've got to address this before they do. And as I said, the most recent attack on Iran, could trigger still, the use of nuclear weapons, and so could Ukraine, and so could, I mean, as we just had a war, an active war between India and Pakistan just a few weeks ago. That could trigger use of nuclear weapons. Trump hasn't put North Korea back on his radar, but I mean, that could also trigger something at any moment. There's just so many danger points, and rather than focus on what percentage of our chances, I mean, I want to put my effort into getting rid of these weapons, because we can do it, and we just gotta do it. And in my what do you call it? The beginning of my book, I dedicated to all these activists who are around the world working on this already and doing amazing work. And we just have to keep at it. We just have to keep doing it, because the risks are there. So you'll all join us.
And on the international front, you talk about the UN, but where is a lot of people would be looking. In fact, your dedication, the book is dedicated to the thousands of nuclear abolition campaigners around the world who are not mentioned by name in this book, and they know who they are. They have worked tirelessly to get us to the starting point of this scenario, and all that remains now is to keep pressing on until nuclear abolition is achieved. A lot of people would think that this is the perfect scenario for the United Nations, without really understanding how the United States works and who is really in control of the UN. But many, I think, would naively believe that this is right in the wheelhouse of the UN. Your thoughts?
Okay, so as I'm sure you all know, the UN was founded in 1945, and the very first resolution that was passed was to abolish nuclear weapons. UN General Assembly Resolution number 1. And every year since then, they've been passing resolutions saying, we got to get rid of these weapons. And that's how we ended up with the treaty finally, after years of enormous pressure from the US not to do anything. The US, as you sort of implied, has a lot of power at the UN. And one of the great things about this treaty, I mean, I was part of this treaty negotiations, and it was very exciting. This was at the UN, and the United States was totally opposed to there being a treaty to ban nuclear weapons. I mean, they've been not just lobbying, but I mean, putting pressure on countries not to support this. And even in Trump's last administration, he even tried to get countries to unratify the treaty after they'd already ratified it. So they don't like this treaty at all. And in fact, when the treaty was being negotiated at the UN, Nikki Haley, who was Trump's UN ambassador, held a demonstration outside the UN saying, what's going on in there is terrible, and we know what we're doing, and we need these weapons to protect us, and blah blah blah. And that was the first time I'd ever experienced being inside the room with all the countries and the government being outside on the demonstration line. I'm usually on the other side. So, that's how much they don't like this treaty. And so the fact that these countries have been willing to stand up against the United States and put their names to this treaty and not only sign it, ratify it, but then, putting these pressures, like, making it illegal to have anything to do with nuclear weapons. I mean, in Ireland, for example, you could go to prison for life for having anything to do with nuclear weapons in Ireland. I mean, that's the kind of pressure we're talking about. If we can get more countries to do that, we've got countries that are divested from nuclear weapons companies already, whole countries, so it is through the United Nations. I mean, it is these countries that are doing what they can do. But I mean, yeah, the UN is a complicated beast, and the US has a lot of power, and it's hard to work through the UN as such. But I agree, they can take it on and do more.
Timmon Wallis, what final question for you? When someone is finished reading this book, what are the three major things you want them to walk away from this book having a better understanding of?
Having a better understanding of. Well, first of all, that getting rid of these weapons is totally doable. We just have to do it. Secondly, you can help do it by getting your city or your town or your faith community or your trade union or your school or your college or your bank, to divest, to boycott, to stigmatize these companies, shame them. You can go on social media, you can go straight to the Boeing page or whatever and say, like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Everybody can do something like that. So that's two things. The third one would be, convince somebody else to read the book and get somebody else on board.
Absolutely. It's a phenomenal read. Incredibly well written. Nuclear Abolition, a Scenario. Dr. Timmon Wallis, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your work. Look forward to having you back. Because this has to be an ongoing conversation.
No, thank you so much.
Greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right, folks. Well, I got to thank my guests for joining me today. Get the book. It's incredibly well done. Want to thank you all so much for listening to the Connecting the Dots podcast with me, Dr. Wilmer Leon. New episode tomorrow, and my guest is going to be how dare I forget his name? Laith Maroof. There we go. Laith Maroof is my guest tomorrow, and we're going to be talking about the ceasefire that never was, is what we're going to be talking about, as Benjamin Netanyahu is roaming the halls of Congress and haunting the White House. Please follow and subscribe, share the show, leave a review. This is where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge. Talk without analysis is just chatter, and we don't chatter here on Connecting the Dots because this is a rhetoric-free podcast. See y'all tomorrow. Until then, I am Dr. Wilmer Leon. Peace. I'm out.
Connecting the Dots with Dr. Wilmer Leon, where the analysis of politics, culture, and history converge.